The chandeliers in the glass garden looked like captured constellations, trembling to a jazz trio that played just soft enough to make the wealthy lean in. The Langford Foundation Gala drew every name that mattered in New Orleans. At the far edge of the room, where palms cast a feathery shade over a mosaic floor, a server slipped, a tray shattered, and the room's attention found the woman with the broom. She moved carefully, as if the glass could still sing. "Leave it," said Edward Langford, who owned the glass and the garden. He lifted a highball and grinned at the circle of donors. "We've an artist among us, haven't we? Tell you what," he said, pointing with the rim of his glass. "If our dear, what's your name, sweetheart? If she can dance the waltz better than my wife, I'll have my son marry her. Right here." The laugh that rose was narrow and mean. The woman looked up. A small scar curved under her left eye. Her hair was pulled into a no-nonsense bun. She was 35, black, and steady-handed, with the posture of someone who had once trusted her bones. "My name is Ava Walker," she said. Charlotte Langford, in champagne silk, arched a brow. "Edward." "It's a party," he purred. "What is a gala without a little game?" Nathan Langford, 28 and mortified, let the ice in his glass melt untouched. "Dad, don't." Edward ignored him and raised his voice until it hopped from crystal to crystal. "Ladies and gentlemen, the glass garden will host a charming duel, taste versus talent." Ava slid the broom into its caddy and stood, spine tall as a metronome. Her supervisor hovered near the palms, silently pleading. Across the floor, the head of security, Lyle Grant, watched in a posture that could pass for neutrality. The trio shifted into a waltz, its three-beat heart like a promise searching for a mouth. Charlotte stepped out first, her smile pinned and perfect, her steps tidy as a tea service. Edward performed pleasure with the vigor of a man flirting with his own reflection. When Charlotte finished, polite applause rose, the kind of clapping where manners do the heavy lifting. She kissed the air toward Ava like a queen tossing a coin. Ava crossed the floor, not to the center, but to the speaker nearest the palms. She turned the volume down a fraction, then returned to the chandelier light. For a heartbeat the room saw only what it expected, a cleaner improvising at a rich man's expense. Then she breathed. It didn't look like rebellion, it looked like memory waking up. Her first turn was small and exact, the second a circle that completed itself with the satisfaction of a key in a rightful lock. Her arms wrote lines so true they scolded the air for settling. She was not simply dancing the counts, she was narrating them back to the music, asking questions, forgiving, returning. Her feet were quiet, respect stitched into each step. Someone near the ice sculpture whispered, "Lord have mercy." Her body remembered the great stages even if the city had decided to forget. The trio, feeling it, brightened. The pianist found a bass line as warm as kitchen light. The violin traded silver for smoke. Edward's grin collapsed into an arrangement of teeth with nowhere to go. He reached for Charlotte's wrist and found only silk. Nathan felt a new shame, the kind that arrives not from a father who sins but from failing to choose whom you will be when someone else's dignity is on the line. Ava turned once more and closed with a breath that met the music exactly, like two travelers arriving by different roads. Silence took the room. Then came the sound money can't script, real applause that lifted to the glass ceiling and back. Charlotte clapped, too, stiff at first, then with the unsteady relief of a woman realizing talent never needed her permission. Lyle Grant stepped forward because sometimes a truth collects in your chest and demands a pair of shoes. "Most of you don't recognize her because you forget what grace looks like without a marquee," he said, voice low but amplified by attention. "Ava Walker is the former principal of the National Conservatory Ballet. She retired after a car accident 7 years ago." The words moved through the room like a small fire disinterested in furniture. Edward blinked as if waking in a house he did not own. Ava didn't flinch. She had not asked to be rescued by a biography. As the hush rearranged, she looked at Edward, then at Nathan, then at anyone who had laughed as if cruelty were a game. "You made a promise," she said to Edward, not unkindly. "You also made a spectacle. One of those can be undone. The other will keep walking around this city wearing your name." "It was a joke," Edward said, a tremor working its way up his throat. "So were the first stones," Nathan answered. And then someone laid bricks. No cheers followed. People listened the way they do when the air has become a mirror. "I'm not asking for a marriage," Ava said. "I'm asking for an apology, and for you to look in the places you hire people to make invisible. If you can't do that, keep your games to yourselves." Lyle's radio crackled, then went shy. He pocketed it and looked at Edward. For the first time all night, the host seemed smaller than the room he had bought. The chandeliers kept shining. Ava stepped back toward the palms, where the broom waited. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. For the moment, the floor was clean. The applause that had cracked the silence did not end politely, it grew into something restless, something searching for a place to land. Some clapped because they had seen beauty, others because they wanted to be on the right side of it. But beneath both lingered the question, what had they just witnessed? Edward Langford's smile thinned into a grimace. His hands, those fat declarations of power, trembled as if applause itself were a kind of betrayal. He tried to raise his glass again, but the whiskey had turned to ash in his mouth. Charlotte, flushed beneath her makeup, slipped into the crowd, weaving between gowns and tuxedos. She needed to escape the feeling that her own performance, once the centerpiece of her husband's ridicule, was already forgotten. Nathan stood still. He had spent his life rehearsing obedience to his father's pride. But now the sound of strangers clapping for Ava's dignity rattled against him like stones in a jar. He could not quiet the thought, what if this is what honor looks like? Ava lingered by the palms. She did not bow, did not smile. She had learned long ago that victory was rarely in the moment but in what followed. She watched Edward sputter, Charlotte withdraw, Nathan struggle. She knew that tonight had only begun. Lyle Grant, the security chief, kept his eyes sweeping the room. He knew spectacle could shift to violence when a man's pride collapsed. He had seen it in bars, in alleys, in boardrooms where money walked out the door. He held his earpiece, not because anyone was speaking, but because listening made people think he was in control. From the edge of the ballroom, a woman with a phone lifted it discreetly. A red light blinked. What began as a drunken game had already started to bleed into something else, the kind of spectacle that escaped walls, slipped through feeds, and grew teeth. Edward cleared his throat, tried for laughter, and failed. "My friends," he began, "you've enjoyed a charming interlude. Let's return to our evening, shall we? The silent auction is open." But the donors were no longer interested in vases and vacation homes. They whispered about Ava, about the way she had moved, about the insult that had backfired. Some leaned closer to Nathan, curious about the son who had spoken against his father. Nathan caught their looks but didn't meet them. He turned toward Ava. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken again. Her stillness was louder than any of Edward's protests. Finally, Edward snapped. "Enough of this," he hissed, stepping forward. "You've had your fun, Miss Walker. Get back to your duties. This is my house." The trio of musicians stilled. The air pressed heavy. Ava stepped out once more, but not toward the dance floor. She walked to the center of the room, her shoes clicking like punctuation marks. "Your house?" she asked softly. "Houses fall. Gardens wilt. Names fade. But how you treat people, especially the ones you think no one sees, that remains." A murmur traveled through the crowd like a tide against pilings. Nathan found himself moving, too, drawn into the space Ava created. He faced his father, his voice low but carrying, "You taught me money builds empires. Tonight she showed me dignity builds legacies." Edward's face reddened, but no reply formed. He was not used to enemies in his own blood. Charlotte returned then, her face pale, her hand clutching her clutch as if it could anchor her. She looked at Ava, then at the guests, then at her husband. Her lips parted, but no defense came. For the first time, she seemed to see the performance she had given as nothing more than steps without soul. Lyle's earpiece finally spoke. "Sir," came a guard's voice, "media vans outside." Words spreading fast. Edward froze. Ava turned, meeting Lyle's eyes. He gave the faintest nod, a soldier's acknowledgement. The ripples had begun. And Ava knew they would not stop at the walls of the glass garden. The glass garden's chandeliers gleamed as if nothing had shifted, but beneath their steady glow, Edward Langford's empire was already cracking. Outside, the hum of media vans grew louder, a swarm of lenses preparing to feed. Inside, whispers chased through the guests like sparks seeking dry timber. Ava stood at the edge of the marble floor. She had no intention of making a scene, but Edward's cruelty had already summoned one. Her body still remembered the rhythm of dance, but her mind remembered something sharper, the years of silence, the headlines that once bore her name in gold, the accident that had left her stranded on the edge of relevance. Tonight had not been her choice, but perhaps it was her chance. Nathan tried to meet her eyes, though he wasn't sure why. He had grown up surrounded by chandeliers, but what Ava carried in her stillness shamed them all. He wanted to say something, apology, admiration, anything, but the weight of his father's shadow pressed down. Edward broke the silence with his fists, pounding twice on the glass podium near the orchestra pit. "Enough." His voice fractured, not the deep baritone that usually commanded rooms but the shrill cry of a man watching the leash slip from his hand. "You are employees, all of you. Paid to serve, not to lecture." He looked at Ava with venom. "And you'll regret this spectacle." Gasps rippled, but no one stepped forward. The donors, dressed in silk and velvet, preferred their drama confined to opera programs, not bleeding onto marble floors. Still, their silence spoke, the tide was shifting, and Edward stood alone. Ava did not lower her gaze. "Respect doesn't come with your paycheck," she said evenly. "It comes with your choices. And tonight, everyone here has seen yours." Her words carried further than his shouts. Charlotte clutched her glass too tightly, the stem snapped, cutting her palm. A bead of red fell onto her gown, a bright accusation. She whispered to no one in particular, "This has gone too far," but no one heard above the weight of Ava's voice. Lyle Grant moved closer now. The head of security was not a man who enjoyed attention, but he had watched Ava's dance, recognized its echo of stages he had once guarded in Washington, Paris, Tokyo. He knew talent when he saw it. He also knew danger when it coiled in Edward's fists. "Sir," he said carefully, "this room is watching. So is the city outside. You can walk back, or you can burn." Edward glared, his pride trembling between fury and fear. He opened his mouth, but the sound was drowned by the sudden flash of cameras at the doorway. Two reporters slipped past the guards, drawn by the scent of scandal. The guests turned as one, moths to the flame of exposure. Ava did not flinch. She had spent years hiding from cameras, ashamed of her broken body. Now, standing in a cleaner's uniform, she faced them with a dignity that no gown could buy. Nathan stepped forward, his voice steady though his hands shook. "You said this was your house, Father. But tonight it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the truth." Edward's face collapsed into silence. He had always believed his fortune could buy narratives. Tonight, the narrative was no longer for sale. Outside, the media vans buzzed. Inside, the empire trembled. And Ava Walker, once erased, felt the faint thrum of resurrection. The ballroom lingered in a state of breathless anticipation, the kind that comes after a storm but before anyone knows how much damage was done. The air smelled faintly of spilled champagne and Charlotte's blood from the broken glass, a reminder that even silk nights could cut. Ava withdrew toward the far wall, not in retreat but in recollection. The echoes of applause still beat against her ribs, mingling with older echoes, the ovations that once thundered through the Kennedy Center, the Paris Opera House, the Royal Theatre in London. Back then, she had been Ava Marlowe, not Ava Walker. A name that once appeared on posters in letters tall enough to touch the rafters. The car accident had rewritten everything. Metal against metal, headlights against rain. The doctors had said her right hip would never turn again, her left ankle never bear the old demands. She had believed them, for a time. Believed them as she buried her pointe shoes in the back of a closet and learned to make beds in hotels instead of taking bows on stage. And yet here she was, in a cleaner's uniform, having moved with a grace the world thought buried. Tonight, against her will, the secret had been unearthed. Nathan stood nearby, close enough to see the flicker of pain and pride in her eyes. He wanted to ask, to understand how someone could lose everything and still carry themselves like a queen. But his throat locked when Edward's hand clamped down on his shoulder. Not another word, Edward growled, dragging him back into the circle of light. You will not side with her. Nathan twisted free, surprising himself as much as his father. I don't need your permission to stand for what's right. The words hung between them, a son's first rebellion against a dynasty built on silence. Guests shifted uncomfortably, but many nodded. They, too, had sons or daughters, some who had walked away, some who had stayed out of fear. Nathan's defiance stung them with memory. Edward's face turned crimson. You ungrateful boy. Do you realize what you're throwing away? This. He swept his arm toward the chandeliers, the glass walls, the orchestra, all of this will be yours. Nathan's reply was soft, but it carried, I don't want a kingdom built on humiliation. A murmur rippled through the crowd, approval dressed in whispers. Charlotte pressed a handkerchief to her palm, her eyes darting between husband and son. She had lived too long in Edward's orbit to imagine life without it, yet she saw the crowd shifting, saw which way the applause had leaned. She realized, with a pang of something like envy, that Ava had drawn the kind of loyalty Charlotte had chased her entire marriage but never earned. Meanwhile, Lal received another call through his earpiece, security can't hold them much longer. Press is flooding in. Let them, Lal muttered, his gaze never leaving Edward. At that moment, Ava turned back toward the center of the room. Not to perform, but to speak. Mr. Langford, I am not your game piece. I am not here to make you laugh, or to prove anything to anyone. But you mocked me in front of this city. You promised your son's life like it was a prize. And now you must face what you've done. Edward opened his mouth, but Ava lifted her hand. It wasn't a command, it was a dancer's gesture, precise, undeniable. The room hushed instantly. You will apologize, she said. Not for me. I've already survived worse than you. But for every person who cleans your floors, carries your trays, drives your cars, and knows that dignity has no uniform. Her words settled like iron into the marble. And though Edward burned with rage, he could not speak. For the first time, the great host had no script. The glass garden had never known silence like this. Even the chandeliers seemed to hum uneasily, as though their light betrayed the mood that had shifted in the room. For decades, Edward Langford had been the conductor of every gathering, the man whose voice dictated when to laugh, when to drink, when to rise. But tonight, control had slipped from his grasp like sand spilling through fingers. Ava stood unwavering, her uniform creased from work, not design. Yet in that simple attire she carried the gravitas of 1,000 curtain calls. Edward, shaking from humiliation, looked smaller than he ever had, and though he tried to summon the booming authority that once ruled boardrooms and banquets, the words would not come. Charlotte lingered at the edge, pressing her wounded hand against her gown, though the bleeding had long stopped. She studied Ava with the eyes of someone recognizing a truth she could not deny. Charlotte's own dance had been precise but hollow, decorative movements that never transcended the floor. Ava's, by contrast, had been something more than art. It had been survival. Nathan felt the weight of decision pressing on him. For years, his father had been the architect of his silence. Tonight, Ava had handed him the blueprint for defiance. His chest tightened with fear, but he knew silence now would be worse than cowardice, it would be complicity. "Father," Nathan said, his voice steadier than he expected, "you owe her more than disdain. You owe her respect." Edward whipped his head around, his face mottled with rage. "You dare shame me in my own house?" Nathan's reply was quiet, but every guest heard it, "You've already done that yourself." The crowd's murmur thickened, a low storm cloud of disapproval. No one applauded yet, but the weight of sympathy tilted toward Ava and Nathan, leaving Edward stranded on his own island of arrogance. Lyle Grant, silent sentinel, stepped forward at last. His broad shoulders blocked part of the chandelier's light as he addressed the host. "Mr. Langford, this isn't about a joke anymore. The press is outside, and they've already got footage. The city will know what happened here, whether you admit it or not." Edward snarled. "You work for me." "No," Lyle corrected calmly. "Tonight, I work for the truth." The word struck harder than fists. Several guests, sensing the inevitable, discreetly slipped their phones from their pockets, filming, documenting. The spectacle was no longer Edward's to control, it belonged to the city now. Ava breathed slowly, grounding herself in the center of the storm. She thought of the accident again, the spinning headlights, the doctor's verdict, and of the years she had scrubbed floors while the world forgot her name. Tonight was not about revenge. It was about reclamation. "Mr. Langford," she said gently, "this is your moment to choose. You can cling to pride until it drowns you, or you can stand like a man and admit you were wrong." Edward looked out at the crowd. For the first time in his life, he saw not admiration, not envy, but judgment. His empire of fear had collapsed, and he stood naked in its ruins. His lips trembled. The apology hovered but refused to form. Then, Charlotte stepped forward, surprising them all. Her voice was small but sharp enough to cut. "Say it, Edward. Or I will." The room gasped. Charlotte, the loyal ornament, had turned. The fracture was complete. The gasp that followed Charlotte's words spread like a wave across the glass garden. Guests shifted on their heels, eager to witness a collapse that wealth could no longer disguise. Edward's face drained of color, as if his wife's quiet rebellion had stripped him of his last shield. For years she had been his elegant echo, smiling when he smiled, standing where he pointed. Tonight, she had stepped beyond the choreography. "Charlotte," Edward hissed, his voice a strained whisper. "Not you." Her eyes burned with a mix of shame and clarity. "Especially me. I've smiled through your cruelties, Edward. I've played hostess to your arrogance. But tonight," she pressed her blood-stained handkerchief to her palm, holding it up for all to see. "Tonight you've cut more than glass. You've cut through the illusion that money makes you noble." The silence was heavier than stone. For the first time, Edward Langford, the man who had built towers and bought senators, looked like a relic, crumbling under his own weight. Nathan stepped closer to his mother, standing between her and his father. "She's right," he said. "All my life you told me to protect the family name. But what is that name worth if it stands for humiliation?" Edward's fury shook his hands, but his words faltered. The crowd's eyes no longer adored him, they measured him. Some pitied, most judged. Ava felt the shift in her bones. It wasn't triumph she felt, it was release, as though the years of silence after her accident were finally dissolving. She did not need Edward's apology for herself anymore, she had reclaimed what he tried to strip away. But she wanted it for everyone still bent beneath the weight of men like him. Mr. Langford, she said, voice low but resonant, you've been given the rarest of gifts, the chance to be forgiven while the world is still watching. Do not waste it. Cameras flashed at the doorway. Reporters pressed closer, security making no effort to stop them now. The Empire's secrets were spilling into the night. Edward staggered back, his eyes darting from Ava to Nathan to Charlotte. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. But no apology came. Pride clung to him like rust on iron, corroding even as it held him together. Charlotte's patience cracked. If you will not speak, then I will. She turned toward the reporters, her voice carrying with unexpected force. I apologize on behalf of this household, for the insult, for the arrogance, for the blindness to dignity that stood before us tonight. Ava Walker is more than the cruelty she endured here. She is grace. She is strength. And she deserves honor, not mockery. The crowd erupted, not in gossip this time, but in applause. Real, sustained, undeniable. It rolled through the glass garden like thunder. Edward collapsed into a chair, his crown shattered. Nathan touched his mother's arm, steadying her. Ava bowed her head, not as a servant but as a woman who had survived, endured, and risen. And outside, as the cameras captured it all, the city prepared to choose whom it would remember, the crumbling tyrant or the reborn artist. The applause did not die quickly. It pulsed through the glass garden like a living thing, rising and falling as though the crowd itself needed to breathe with it. Edward sat slumped in his chair, shoulders hunched, his whiskey glass trembling in his grip. The man who once filled every room with his voice had been reduced to silence. Charlotte stood tall beside Nathan, her gown shimmering with the weight of her defiance. For years she had lived in Edward's shadow, playing the perfect ornament to his arrogance. Now, in front of cameras and guests, she had broken from him, and for the first time, her beauty carried the sheen of truth. Ava remained still. She was not intoxicated by the applause, nor distracted by the flash of cameras. She had known the roar of ovations greater than this one, and she had known silence far heavier. What steadied her now was not the sound, but the fact that Edward's cruelty had been met with resistance. It was never about spectacle, it was about dignity. Lyle Grant kept his post near the edge of the room, but his eyes softened. He had guarded politicians, celebrities, billionaires, but rarely had he seen someone dismantle power without raising her voice. Ava had turned the whole room into her witness, and she had done it with nothing more than truth. Reporters pressed forward, shoving microphones toward Charlotte, toward Nathan, toward Ava. Mrs. Langford, are you leaving your husband? One asked. Mr. Langford, another shouted, do you stand by your father or by Ms. Walker? Nathan raised a hand, his voice firm, this isn't about my family's drama. This is about respect. My father failed to show it. My mother found the courage to demand it. And Ms. Walker, he turned toward Ava, reminded us all what it really means. Cameras clicked wildly. Nathan had just drawn a line in the sand, and the crowd knew history was being written under the chandeliers. Edward attempted to rise, but his legs betrayed him. He sank back down, his face red with humiliation. He looked at Charlotte, but she did not return his gaze. He looked at Nathan, but found only defiance. When at last he looked at Ava, he saw not the cleaner he had mocked but the woman who had stripped him of every illusion. Say it, Charlotte whispered again, her voice trembling but relentless. The silence stretched, aching. And then Edward, choking on his own bitterness, managed 3 words, I am sorry. It was not grand. It was not eloquent. But it was the first fracture in his pride. A hush followed. Guests leaned in, waiting for Ava's reply. She inhaled, slow and steady. Those words mean nothing, she said gently, unless they are lived tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Tonight you've been unmasked. What you do with that truth, that is your legacy. The cameras caught every syllable. And in that moment, it became clear, Ava Walker was no longer invisible. Outside the glass garden, news anchors rehearsed their opening lines while technicians hoisted cables over shoulders. The story had escaped the room, it now belonged to the city. Inside, the chandeliers still burned, though they now illuminated something closer to reckoning than celebration. Edward Langford sat as if nailed to his chair, the half-spoken apology sagging in the air. It had not soothed the crowd. If anything, it had exposed him further, like a king forced to wear his crown while stripped of his robes. Nathan stood tall, aware of every camera fixed on him. He had grown up coached on posture, diction, appearances. But tonight he spoke from a place deeper than etiquette. Ava is right, he said, his voice carrying through the ballroom. Respect is not an accessory. It cannot be bought, borrowed, or forced. It is earned. Some guests nodded openly now, their murmurs no longer restrained by fear. A few even clapped, cautious but sincere. Charlotte, hand pressed against her gown, turned her gaze to Edward. You've demanded loyalty for decades, Edward. But loyalty without respect is slavery. Tonight, I am finished playing the part you wrote for me. Her voice cracked on the last words, but they were strong enough to pierce the air. The crowd reacted with a stunned hush. Some women in sequin dresses exchanged glances of recognition, as though Charlotte's defiance spoke to prisons they, too, inhabited. Ava felt the weight of the moment pressing in on her. She had not sought to tear a family apart, but the fracture was inevitable, the crack had been there long before she entered this ballroom. Tonight only revealed it. She looked at Charlotte, then at Nathan, and felt a strange kinship. They, too, were learning how to breathe outside Edward's shadow. Edward lurched to his feet at last, whiskey splashing onto the marble. Enough, he bellowed, voice ragged. Do you all think one performance erases a lifetime of power? She is nothing but, he stopped himself, realizing too late that every insult now dug his grave deeper. The cameras feasted on his fury. Lyle Grant stepped forward, steady and firm. Mr. Langford, he said, for your sake, sit down. The city is watching. The world may be by morning. Edward glared, sweat shining under the chandelier light. But even he could sense the tide had turned. With a grunt, he sank back into the chair, a titan broken in public. Ava drew a slow breath and spoke once more, her tone unshaken. I don't want your empire. I don't want your name. I don't even want your apology if it's just words. What I want, what I demand, is that you treat every soul who works beneath your roof with the respect you denied me tonight. A burst of applause rose again, stronger than before, echoing against glass walls. The cameras drank it in, broadcasting not just Ava's demand but the crowd's response. Edward lowered his head, silent. And though the night was not yet over, it was clear, the man who once owned the room had lost it, and the woman he tried to humiliate had claimed a power far greater than his fortune. The ballroom was no longer a sanctuary for the wealthy, it had become a theater of truth. The marble floor, polished for glamour, now reflected the weight of humiliation and revelation. Reporters lined the doors, their cameras blinking like restless fireflies, and every guest knew the night's scandal was already spreading across the city like sparks carried on the wind. Edward Langford sat rigid, jaw clenched, every breath shallow. For decades, he had believed his fortune immune to scrutiny. But now, surrounded by velvet gowns and tailored tuxedos, he was the spectacle. His empire of intimidation was crumbling beneath the harsh light of accountability. Nathan remained upright, his hand lightly resting on Charlotte's shoulder. He had always been the reluctant heir, the silent observer at galas and fundraisers. Tonight, silence had become impossible. He had chosen a side, and for the first time in his life, it was not his father's. Charlotte herself looked transformed. The wound in her palm had dried, leaving only a faint stain on her gown, but her eyes gleamed with a clarity that surprised even her. She no longer looked like Edward's ornament, she looked like a woman rediscovering her own reflection. Ava stood at the center, her uniform still rumpled, but to the crowd she seemed clothed in something regal. She had not raised her voice, had not begged for pity. Yet her presence commanded more than any chandelier or orchestra. She was not here to destroy Edward, though that might well be the outcome. She was here to restore her own dignity, and by extension, the dignity of countless others who lived unseen. One reporter broke through the circle of guests. "Ms. Walker," he said, microphone trembling, "the world just watched you humble one of the city's most powerful men. Who are you?" The question hung like a challenge, and Ava hesitated. She had hidden her past for so long that speaking it aloud felt like inviting an old wound to bleed again. But she saw the eyes fixed on her, curious, reverent, hungry for truth. And she decided to give it to them. "I was once a dancer," she said softly. "Ava Marlowe. Principal of the National Conservatory Ballet. I lost it all in an accident that should have ended me. But I am still here. Tonight, I am not a servant. Tonight, I am simply a woman who refused to be diminished." The room gasped. Some older patrons remembered her name, remembered the glowing reviews, the triumphant posters. A few even clutched their pearls as though they had just glimpsed a ghost. Edward lurched forward. "This changes nothing," he spat. "You're still nothing without a stage." Ava's reply was calm, steady as stone. "A stage is anywhere people are watching. Tonight, Mr. Langford, the stage is yours, and you are failing your performance." The ballroom erupted, applause and murmurs colliding in a thunderous wave. The cameras caught every word. Edward collapsed back into his chair, his empire burning around him, not with fire, but with exposure. And Ava Walker, reborn from the ashes of Ava Marlowe, stood radiant in her truth. By midnight, the glass garden no longer felt like a gala. It felt like a tribunal. The chandeliers still sparkled, but their light illuminated truths money had long tried to bury. Every guest was now a witness, every camera a judge. Edward Langford, once the king of the room, sat hollow-eyed in his chair, his authority stripped to bone. His fingers dug into the armrests as though clinging to the last remnants of control. But the world he had built on intimidation and spectacle was unraveling thread by thread. Charlotte stood nearby, posture straight, hand no longer trembling. The dried blood on her gown had become a badge of rebellion, a mark of the fracture she would never mend with Edward. For years she had accepted humiliation as part of survival in his orbit. Tonight, survival had taken a new form, truth. Nathan, though shaken, felt a strange fire in his chest. Speaking against his father had been terrifying, but the silence that followed had confirmed he could never return to obedience. He had chosen his path, and though uncertain, it was his. The cameras capturing his defiance only reinforced that choice. His life would be measured by this moment. Ava remained at the center, her presence no longer questioned. She had reclaimed her identity in front of strangers, and in doing so, she had discovered something more important. She was no longer hiding from herself. The name Ava Marlowe no longer chained her to grief, it reminded her that grace never dies, it only waits to be remembered. Reporters pressed forward again. "Ms. Walker," one asked, "what happens now? Will you return to the stage?" Ava let the question linger. She could feel every gaze, every expectation. Years ago, she would have answered without hesitation, but life had taught her that rebirth comes slowly, not all at once. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice both weary and luminous. "But I will not return to silence." The words landed with more force than any performance. The crowd erupted once more, their applause no longer tinged with curiosity but with reverence. Ava had become not only a dancer rediscovered but a symbol, of survival, of dignity, of resistance against arrogance. Edward could take no more. He rose abruptly, his chair screeching against the marble. "You think you've won?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "This is just gossip. Tomorrow they'll forget. They always forget." But no one moved to support him. Not Charlotte. Not Nathan. Not even his closest allies among the donors. The applause for Ava drowned him out, wave after wave. The world outside would not forget, Lyle's earpiece confirmed it, broadcasts already live. She's everywhere. Edward's lips twisted in fury, but no words came. He turned and staggered toward the exit, shoulders sagging, his empire's crown crumbling with each step. Charlotte exhaled, long and steady. Nathan placed his hand gently on Ava's shoulder. "He's finished," he whispered. Ava shook her head. "No. He will finish himself. That is his burden, not mine." The applause swelled again, not just for her dance but for her truth. And for the first time in 7 years, Ava felt the possibility of a future no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she could build. The ballroom slowly emptied, though the echoes of applause clung stubbornly to its glass walls. Guests departed in murmuring clusters, their silks and tuxedos rustling with nervous energy. They whispered Ava's name, both names, Walker and Marlowe, as though rehearsing which one would be remembered in tomorrow's headlines. Charlotte slipped away first, escorted by a discreet aide who avoided cameras. For years she had left galas on her husband's arm, but tonight she walked alone. Some pitied her, others admired her, but none could deny she had chosen dignity over decorum. Her silence had broken as loudly as any symphony. Nathan lingered, speaking quietly with a reporter who asked whether he stood by his father. "I stand by respect," he replied. The journalist pressed for more, but Nathan refused to be baited into scandal. He had made his choice on the marble floor, the rest of his life would be the echo. Lyle remained on duty, though his eyes no longer scanned for threats in the usual way. He watched Ava, recognizing a resilience he had rarely encountered in men twice her size. She had walked into the evening invisible and emerged untouchable, not because she had sought power but because she had embodied it. Ava herself waited until the last guests had gone. The janitorial staff reappeared with mops and bins, quietly undoing the chaos of spilled champagne and shattered glass. They moved differently tonight, stealing glances at Ava with a reverence that humbled her. One young woman, no older than 20, whispered, "Thank you," before vanishing with her cart. Outside, the night had transformed. Satellite trucks crowded the curb. Headlines blinked across screens already, Cleaner revealed as former ballet star humiliates Langford at gala. Commentators speculated, analysts dissected, and Ava's name trended like wildfire. But inside, the glass garden felt almost sacred now, emptied of arrogance, filled with the residue of truth. Ava walked slowly across the marble floor, her shoes clicking softly, each step a reminder that she still carried balance, even after years of doubt. Nathan approached her cautiously. "You changed everything tonight," he said. She smiled faintly. "I only reminded people of what should never have been forgotten." He hesitated, searching her face. "I don't know what comes next for me. But I know I want it to be different than what my father built." Ava studied him carefully. She had seen rebellion before, loud, brash, self-serving. Nathan's defiance carried something gentler, a yearning for honor. She nodded. "Then build with respect. Empires fall. Integrity doesn't." The words seemed to anchor him. For the first time all night, Nathan breathed as though free of a weight. Lyle cleared his throat. "Ms. Walker," he said, "the media won't stop. They'll want interviews, documentaries, maybe even contracts. You'll need to decide quickly how much of yourself you want to give back to the world." Ava looked around the ballroom, remembering her first ovations, the crash that ended them, the long years of silence. Her voice was steady. "I'll give them only what I choose. This time, the story is mine." And with that, the woman once erased by tragedy walked out into the New Orleans night, reborn, not as a cleaner, not as a victim, but as a survivor whose truth had become fire. By morning, New Orleans awoke to a new headline. Every paper, every feed, every broadcast carried the same story, from mop to masterpiece: Ava Walker, the dancer who defied the Langfords. Her performance was looped on television, dissected online, shared in millions of reposts. Some admired her resilience, others reveled in Edward Langford's public disgrace. But no one could ignore her. Ava watched from the small apartment she rented above a laundromat. The screen on her battered television flickered, showing her figure in the glass garden, spinning with a grace that seemed impossible in the uniform she wore. She switched it off after a few seconds. She did not need to relive the dance, the steps were already carved into her bones. Her phone buzzed endlessly. Unknown numbers, requests for interviews, offers from agents she had never met. Even an old colleague from the conservatory left a message: "The world remembers you, Ava. Come back to us." She pressed her palms to her eyes. For years she had begged the world to forget, to stop reminding her of the career shattered in twisted metal. Now, when she had finally carved a quiet existence, the world came storming back. Across town, the Langford mansion was besieged by cameras. Reporters shouted questions through the gates, their words like stones hurled at windows. Edward refused to appear. Inside, he raged in silence, breaking decanters against walls, each shatter a feeble attempt to drown out the headlines. Charlotte had retreated to a guest wing, her phone buzzing with messages of support from women who confessed they had envied her life but now admired her courage. Nathan, however, chose a different path. He left the mansion entirely, checking into a modest hotel on the other side of the city. That morning, he gave a brief statement to the press: "I will not defend cruelty, not even in my own family. Ava Walker deserves respect, and I stand with her." His words spread nearly as quickly as Ava's dance. At noon, Ava ventured outside. The street buzzed with onlookers who recognized her from their screens. Some approached shyly, asking for a photograph, others pressed notes of gratitude into her hand. A few told her stories of their own humiliations, the bosses who belittled them, the nights they had swallowed pride to survive. Ava listened quietly, humbled that her defiance had become their anthem. But storms do not pass so quickly. That evening, as she returned to her apartment, she found a letter slipped beneath her door. The envelope bore no name. Inside was a single line, scrawled in haste: "Be careful. Power does not die quietly." She folded the paper slowly, feeling the weight of its warning. Edward Langford had lost the room, but men like him rarely surrendered without fight. And as night fell over the city, Ava realized her battle had only begun. The letter lay on Ava's kitchen table like a shard of broken glass. She stared at the hastily written warning, her fingers tracing the uneven strokes. For 7 years she had lived quietly, her battles internal, her grief tucked away where no one could find it. Now, the struggle had spilled into the open, and the silence she had once craved was gone. Outside, the city swirled with speculation. Cafes buzzed with debates about the gala. Newspapers sold out in hours, their front pages emblazoned with Ava's face beside Edward's scowl. Commentators called it the moment dignity toppled arrogance. Social media crowned her a heroine. Yet in the shadows, whispers spread about Edward's vengeance. He had wealth, connections, and allies who would fight to keep their own secrets buried. Nathan called her that morning. His voice carried exhaustion but also resolve. "I know my father," he said. "He'll strike back, not with fists, but with influence. Smear campaigns, lawsuits, anything to claw back control." Ava listened quietly. "Then let him. I've been invisible before. If he tries to drag me through mud, I'll still stand taller than he ever could." Nathan paused, then said softly, "You don't have to face this alone." She almost laughed. Alone was all she had known for years. Yet something in his tone made her pause, an echo of sincerity, not pity. Meanwhile, Charlotte gave her first interview since the gala. Sitting in her own parlor, she spoke to a female journalist from the Times-Picayune. Her voice trembled but grew steadier as she went on. I stayed silent for too long. I believed protecting Edward's reputation was my duty. But silence is its own cruelty. Ava Walker gave me the courage to break mine. The article painted Charlotte as a woman awakening from gilded captivity. The public sympathized, applauding her honesty. Edward's isolation deepened. But Edward was not idle. Behind the walls of his mansion, calls were made. Old debts were collected, favors demanded. A smear piece appeared online within hours. Ava Walker, fallen ballerina or fabricated hero? It questioned her past, exaggerated her injuries, implied her dance had been staged for attention. The comments section filled with venom and defense in equal measure. Ava read only the headline before shutting the laptop. She had known this was coming. The world loved to crown heroes but loved just as much to tear them down. That night, she returned to her mirror, the same cracked rectangle she had used for years to rehearse in secret. She stood in silence, staring at her reflection. Her body bore the scars of the accident, her hips stiff, her ankle aching with every turn. But when she raised her arms, when she closed her eyes, she felt the music bloom again. Her reflection whispered back, "You are still here. You are still enough." The letter's warning lingered, but Ava understood something vital: she could not be broken by lies. She had already been broken once, and she had risen. And this time, she was not rising alone. The city's fascination with Ava Walker did not fade. By the end of the week, she was invited onto morning shows, radio programs, even podcasts recorded in cluttered apartments. Some requests were earnest, others predatory, each seeking a piece of the spectacle. Ava declined most. She was not interested in being consumed, she wanted her story told on her terms. Nathan, however, became her unexpected ally in the public eye. His statement of support continued to circulate, painting him as the son who chose honor over inheritance. Invitations poured in for him too, commentators hungry for a fractured family narrative. He accepted only one, appearing briefly on a late-night broadcast where he said, "I don't stand against my father. I stand for what's right." Ava showed us all what dignity looks like. The clip went viral. Edward raged. Locked inside his mansion, he unleashed fury on lawyers, advisors, anyone who dared suggest restraint. "She humiliated me," he roared. "She will not walk away untouched." His lawyers drafted defamation suits. His allies in media sharpened their pens. But the more he fought, the more desperate he appeared, like a man clawing at smoke. Charlotte stayed quiet after her interview, retreating into silence not from fear but from exhaustion. She had lived decades in Edward's orbit, and now every step away from him felt like both liberation and loss. Alone in her room, she replayed Ava's words, "Respect doesn't come with your paycheck, it comes with your choices." Charlotte wondered what choices she had left. Ava received a visitor one evening. Lyle Grant appeared at her apartment door, still dressed in the dark suit of a security chief. His presence filled the small hallway. "You need to know something," he said quietly. "Langford's people are digging. They're trying to spin your accident, your years away, even the fact that you work as a cleaner. They want to make it look like desperation, not dignity." Ava folded her arms. "Let them. Truth doesn't vanish because someone calls it a lie." Lyle studied her for a long moment. "Most people crack under that kind of pressure. You didn't in the ballroom. I hope you won't now." She met his gaze evenly. "I broke once already. I survived. What can they take from me now?" Yet later that night, alone with her reflection, Ava admitted a quiet fear, not of Edward's attacks, but of being consumed by the very attention that had resurrected her. Fame was a stage she knew too well, one that demanded pieces of your soul until you forgot which parts belonged to you. On her kitchen table, the anonymous letter still lay folded. Power does not die quietly. She understood now, it had not been a warning. It had been a prophecy. And the storm had only just begun to gather. The days that followed felt like a fever dream for Ava Walker. Her face, once hidden behind cleaning carts and shadows, now filled screens across the country. Morning shows dissected her dance frame by frame, commentators on late-night television praised her composure, and columnists debated what her rise meant in a city long accustomed to bowing before money. The story was no longer hers alone, it had become a symbol, a mirror people held to their own struggles. But for Ava, fame was a double-edged sword. Each interview request carried the glint of exploitation. Strangers who had never cared about her silence now fought to profit from her voice. She turned down most offers, though some days she wondered if retreating meant surrendering the chance to reclaim her art. In the evenings, she sat before her cracked mirror, practicing movements slowly, gently, her ankle still stiff, her hip protesting, but she moved anyway. The world might call it a comeback, she called it survival. Nathan sought her company more often now. He would arrive without cameras, bringing takeout boxes from small restaurants hidden in side streets. He seemed relieved to sit in her modest apartment, free from the suffocating weight of his father's name. One evening, over steaming bowls of gumbo, he confessed, "I used to think power meant controlling rooms, commanding attention. But you showed me that true power is refusing to bow, even when the world demands it." Ava studied him, sensing the sincerity in his tone. He was young enough to reshape his destiny, yet old enough to carry the scars of his father's tyranny. She admired his courage but worried about the burden he carried. "Your father will not forgive you," she said softly. "You know that, don't you?" Nathan's eyes flickered, torn between grief and resolve. "Then let him curse my name. I'd rather walk away with dignity than inherit a crown built on cruelty." Meanwhile, Charlotte's transformation deepened. Her interview had unleashed a flood of letters, some from women who confessed they had envied her lifestyle, others from those who admitted they had endured similar silences. Charlotte read them late into the night, tears staining the stationery. For the first time in decades, she felt seen, not as Edward's wife, but as a woman who had chosen truth over comfort. She reached out to Ava quietly, arranging to meet her in a small cafe away from cameras. Their conversation stretched for hours, weaving threads of shared pain and resilience. Edward, however, grew more dangerous. Though publicly humiliated, he still commanded a network of allies unwilling to see their patron fall. Articles began to surface questioning Ava's past, suggesting she had fabricated parts of her career or exaggerated her injuries for sympathy. Anonymous voices on social media hurled insults, calling her an opportunist, a fraud, a woman desperate for relevance. Ava read them in silence, her chest tightening, but she did not reply. She knew shadows always fought hardest when the light was strongest. One night, after a long day of noise and rumors, Ava returned home to find another letter slipped under her door. This one was longer, the handwriting careful, deliberate. "Be cautious. The storm is not over. He has friends who fear your truth more than his downfall. Do not underestimate their reach." She folded the note slowly, a chill rippling through her. It was one thing to face Edward's wrath, it was another to stand against the invisible machinery of power that lurked behind him. Yet even as fear brushed against her spine, a fire stirred. She had survived tragedy, humiliation, and silence. If the storm came for her, she would meet it standing tall. The next morning, Ava walked past the laundromat downstairs and into the street where children chalked patterns on the sidewalk. One little girl looked up, wide-eyed, and said, "You're the lady who danced." Ava knelt down, smiling. "Yes. But you know what's better than dancing? Believing you can." The girl giggled, twirling awkwardly, her laughter spilling into the air like sunlight. Ava rose, realizing in that small exchange what her journey meant. It was no longer about Edward, or even her career. It was about reminding others, especially those the world tried to make invisible, that dignity was not granted by wealth or status. It lived in every choice, every refusal to bow. And as Edward plotted in his mansion, as the city argued in headlines, as strangers scribbled warnings in ink, Ava Walker knew this truth: storms could shake her, but they could not erase her. The storm Ava had been warned about began to take shape. It wasn't loud or sudden, it crept in quietly, like smoke seeping under a door. Edward Langford might have lost his crown in public, but he still commanded an empire behind the curtains, lawyers who could twist facts into weapons, journalists who owed him favors, and politicians whose campaigns had been fed by his fortune. Humiliation had wounded him, but it had not disarmed him. Now, he moved in the shadows, setting wheels in motion. Within days, stories surfaced that painted Ava in cruel tones. A tabloid accused her of fabricating her ballet injuries, claiming she had quit the stage out of jealousy, not tragedy. Another suggested she had engineered the gala confrontation to relaunch her career. An anonymous source hinted that she had demanded hush money from the Langfords. None of it was true, but the repetition of lies gave them teeth. Ava read the headlines in silence. The sting was sharp, but not unfamiliar. She had faced ridicule before, when critics once questioned whether a black ballerina could hold center stage at the conservatory, when doctors declared her broken, when society turned its back on her after the accident. Each wound had scarred her, but each scar had hardened into strength. This, she reminded herself, was not new. Yet what weighed heavier were the calls from well-meaning strangers urging her to fight back. Agents begged her to sue, to speak, to appear on every channel. Activists wanted her as their spokesperson, their banner against injustice. Admirers wanted her to return to the stage immediately. Ava understood their hunger, but she also understood the cost. To fight on everyone's terms was to lose herself all over again. One evening, Nathan visited her apartment carrying stacks of printouts, articles, legal briefs, dossiers on Edward's allies. He laid them on her kitchen table like maps of a battlefield. "We need to be strategic," he insisted. "My father's reach is wide. If we don't counter every move, he'll bury you under the noise." Ava listened, her hands folded. "I don't need to fight his war. That's what he wants. He wants me tangled in his games until I forget who I am." Nathan shook his head, his frustration sharp. "But silence looks like surrender. People need to hear you." "They already did," Ava replied softly. "On that ballroom floor. That's the voice that matters." Nathan fell quiet, his shoulders slumping. He wanted to protect her, but he also knew she was right. Ava's power had never come from shouting louder, it had come from standing still until the world was forced to listen. Meanwhile, Charlotte faced her own reckoning. Though the public sympathized with her, life in the Langford mansion had turned unbearable. Edward raged behind closed doors, accusing her of betrayal, of weakness, of tarnishing his legacy. He paced their gilded halls like a caged animal, throwing crystal decanters against walls, his curses echoing. At last, Charlotte packed a single suitcase and left, her departure captured by a few opportunistic cameras outside the gates. She issued no statement, but her absence spoke volumes. In her hotel room, Charlotte wept, not for Edward, but for the years she had given to silence. Yet beneath the grief lay something else, relief. She had stepped out of his empire, and even though the world might judge her, she felt lighter than she had in decades. Back in her apartment, Ava received another letter. This one was typed, clean, deliberate. "You've awakened something larger than you. They will not forgive. Guard yourself." She placed it beside the first warning, her fingers brushing the paper. Fear pressed against her ribs, but so did clarity. The storm wasn't about her alone, it was about a system that thrived on arrogance and silence. She had become the spark, but the fire was not hers to extinguish. That night, she dreamed of the stage again. Not the bright lights of Paris or New York, but a modest community theater, its wooden floor creaking beneath children's eager feet. In the dream, she guided them, her hands shaping their movements, her voice teaching them to find balance not only in dance but in dignity. When she woke, tears streaked her face, but her chest felt lighter. Perhaps this was the path. Not returning to her old throne, but building something new from its ashes. And as Edward plotted in his mansion, as his allies whispered in corridors, Ava understood a truth she had carried all along: power could wound her, smear her, even threaten her life. But it could not erase the grace she had fought to reclaim. The machinery of power was grinding into motion. But so was she. The city of New Orleans could not look away. Every cafe table, barber's chair, and subway seat carried the same conversation: Ava Walker versus Edward Langford. Some framed it as a scandal, others as a reckoning. But for the first time in decades, Edward was not the one controlling the narrative. Ava tried to move quietly through the noise. She avoided the glossy studios and polished stages offered to her, but she could not avoid the people. Strangers stopped her on sidewalks, in grocery aisles, even as she walked past children chalking rainbows on cracked concrete. They thanked her not for her dance, but for standing tall when the world expected her to bow. One elderly woman gripped her hand and whispered, "You gave me back my voice." Ava carried those words more carefully than any trophy. Nathan's estrangement from his father deepened. He refused to return to the Langford mansion, choosing instead to spend nights in modest hotels or on a friend's couch. He accompanied Ava when the press swarmed her, serving as a quiet shield. Yet behind his resolve was a gnawing guilt. He confessed it late one night, over lukewarm coffee in Ava's kitchen. "All these years, I let him humiliate people and said nothing. I was afraid of losing everything. But now, I wonder, what was it I ever really had?" Ava studied him with the steady patience of someone who knew shame intimately. "You had his shadow," she said. "And shadows only grow when no one dares to light a lamp." Meanwhile, Charlotte's departure from the mansion became public when a neighbor leaked photographs of her suitcase-laden car. Reporters painted her as either tragic victim or brave rebel. She released a single statement: "I am learning who I am without silence." The line struck chords far beyond New Orleans, shared across social media as a rallying cry for women who had long endured in quiet. Edward, however, refused to retreat. His lawyers announced a defamation suit against Ava, demanding millions for irreparable harm to reputation. The city laughed bitterly. Edward's reputation was already ashes. Still, the threat of litigation stirred unease in Ava's circle. Courtrooms were not stages of truth, they were arenas of influence, and Edward had long stocked them with allies. When Ava received the news, she sat for a long time in silence. Fear curled in her stomach, not for herself but for the people who had pinned their hopes to her resilience. What if she lost? What if her story was twisted until even dignity seemed like deceit? That evening, she returned to the cracked mirror. She began to dance again, not grand leaps or furious pirouettes, but slow, deliberate movements. Each step grounded her, each breath steadied her. As her reflection followed, she whispered, "You are not on trial. He is." Across the city, protests ignited. Crowds gathered outside the Langford offices, holding signs that read "Respect is nobility and we are Ava." Musicians played her waltz in the streets, children mimicked her graceful turns. What Edward intended as her silencing had instead amplified her voice into a chorus. Nathan stood at one such gathering, blending into the crowd. For the first time, he felt part of something larger than his father's empire, something real, something human. The chants rose around him, and he realized his inheritance was not marble towers but the courage to choose a different path. Inside the Langford mansion, Edward watched the footage alone. His empire was not simply crumbling, it was being rewritten without him. Rage burned in his chest, but behind it flickered something colder: fear. For the first time in his life, he was no longer the author of the story. And for Ava Walker, that knowledge was victory enough. The courthouse stood like an ancient sentinel, its marble steps worn smooth by years of footsteps, its columns heavy with the weight of judgment. Crowds pressed against barricades outside, their chants rolling like thunder across the plaza, "We are Ava. Dignity is power." Camera lights flashed, feeding the world a spectacle Edward Langford had intended to control, but which had long since slipped from his grasp. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation. Ava sat quietly at the defense table, her posture calm, her hands folded neatly on the polished wood. She wore no designer suit, no crafted image, only a simple navy dress that echoed her humility and strength. Beside her, Nathan offered quiet words of encouragement, his loyalty unshaken. Lyle, though not bound to her, had come too, standing at the back like a sentinel of solidarity. Edward entered flanked by attorneys, his suit pressed to perfection, his scowl ironclad. Yet there was no hiding the fatigue etched in his face, the tremor in his hands. Once, his presence had commanded silence. Now it invited whispers. The proceeding stretched long. Edward's lawyers painted Ava as manipulative, claiming she had orchestrated the gala performance to humiliate their client, to resurrect a career that had died on its own merit. They called her a fallen ballerina desperate for relevance. Each word was meant to wound, to chip away at her dignity. But when it was Ava's turn, she rose not with venom but with clarity. Her voice carried the quiet strength that had silenced a ballroom. "I did not seek this battle. I came to that gala as a worker, not a performer. It was Edward Langford who made me his target. He tried to use me as a spectacle, to turn my humanity into a joke. I danced not to embarrass him, but to reclaim myself. I have nothing to prove, except that respect is not a privilege, it is a right." Her words stilled the room. Even the judge paused, pen frozen above paper. Nathan was called next, and his testimony was firm. "I stood beside my father for years, watching him belittle others. That night, I chose to stand with truth. I will not apologize for that." His voice cracked with emotion, but his eyes never wavered. When Charlotte took the stand, Edward's empire cracked further. She spoke plainly, her words carrying the weight of decades. "I was silent for too long. I enabled cruelty with my silence. But that night, Ava's courage forced me to see what I had become. I will not return to silence. And I will not defend Edward Langford again." The case, meant to crush Ava, instead dismantled Edward. The judge dismissed the lawsuit with sharp words about misuse of the legal system. Outside, the crowd erupted, their cheers rising like hymns of victory. But Ava did not celebrate with shouting or fists raised. She stepped onto the courthouse steps, the cameras crowding, microphones thrust forward. She lifted her chin, speaking not for herself but for all who watched. "This was never about me alone. It was about every person who has been told they are less, every worker dismissed as invisible, every voice silenced by arrogance. I am no longer hiding. And neither should you." The crowd roared, the chants blending into a single voice that shook the plaza. That evening, as the sun dipped over New Orleans, Ava walked past a small community theater where children practiced clumsy leaps and awkward spins. She paused, smiling as she heard their laughter. One day soon, she promised herself, she would step inside, not as a star reclaiming glory, but as a teacher giving it away. Edward retreated into obscurity, his empire weakened beyond repair. Nathan began a new life, unshackled from his father's shadow. Charlotte, finally free, lent her voice to women who refused to remain silent. And Ava Walker, once Ava Marlowe, once broken, once forgotten, built something greater than a stage. She built a sanctuary where dignity itself could dance. The night of humiliation had ended. The dawn of grace had begun.